So, the Ottomans. I have to say they're pretty unique. Of course, I don't like to say that the Ottoman Sultanate only had bad rulers after Suleiman the Magnificent, but as far as sultans go, anything that came after him really was a step behind. There are rulers after him who were pretty good, and even some of them I would consider excellent, but truth be told, the Ottomans never really got anything quite like the first sultans. In fact, not spoiling anything for you people, but 8 out of the first 10 sultans are in the top 10. Though I should still note, I think the Ottomans didn't have that many bad rulers. I actually think the eventual decline came due to an unfavorable geopolitical realignment, stemming from the discovery of the Americas and expansion of trade that slowly made the Ottomans increasingly irrelevant as time wore on, and not so much because of a poor ruling class. Well then, who counts and who doesn't? Well, the sultans who divided the sultanate after the disastrous Battle of Ankara don't count, except Mehmed the Restorer, of course. Claimants like Mustafa the Imposter or Cem won't be counted either. And finally, the last caliph, Abdulmejid II, won't be on this list either, as the Ottoman Sultanate was officially abolished by the time the Turkish National Assembly elected him caliph. Everyone else is in the list. 36. Mustafa IV. He died the same day he ordered the execution of his cousin and previous sultan. I know I don't usually swear in these videos, but honest to God, I can't describe his rather short reign as anything other than a complete shit show. Rioting janissaries, loads of revolts, material shortages, and no order whatsoever. By the time his brother deposed him, one would just be glad it's over. I think he deserves his placement on the list. Honestly, easiest time I had picking bottom. 35. Abdulaziz. Just not a good ruler. There is no single event which necessarily led to his eventual deposition, but rather a combination of several factors. Some can be attributed to him, others not. Under him, the Ottoman Empire lost large swaths of Eastern Europe, leading to the re-establishment of the Bulgarian state and the de jure independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, as well as the loss of Kars to Russia. Also, the Ottoman state defaulted in debt. He was integral in establishing the first Ottoman civil code, but that doesn't really compensate. 34. Mustafa the Mad. His rise to power started a principle of seniority that will last until the end of the empire. Also, he may not actually have been mad. Was he a good sultan? Not really. In truth, he was essentially a puppet in his first reign of court cliques and in his second of the janissaries. He would be executed by his successor, Mahmud IV. 33. Ibrahim the Mad. Obligatory insane monarch every country has to have. Of course, just because someone's insane doesn't mean he's automatically a bad ruler. In this case, however, yeah, he was bad. He preferred being surrounded by his harem than the affairs of ruling. Which, honestly, it's understandable. Ironically, the first 4 years of his reign were very good, with the appointed Grand Vizier stabilizing the frontiers, stabilizing the currency, reducing the number of janissaries, curbing the power of disobedient governors, all good stuff. But ultimately he came under the influence of unsuitable people and eventually blundered his way into being regicided. An example of a pretty awful ruler having a not so bad reign. 32. Abdul Hamid II. The last ruler to actually exert control over what had become by this point a fracturing state. He created a massive modernization project which, while good, ultimately ceded the empire's finances to foreign powers. Massacres also happened, but really that isn't what drops him so low on this list. Rather, the fact his stubborn clinginess to his absolute rule is ultimately what got him deposed in the end. Tale as old as time. 31. Abdul Hamid I. To put it bluntly, he did not have a good time. His reign was marked by Russia's continued exploitation of Ottoman weakness, leading to him signing a humiliating treaty where Russia would hereby have the right to intervene on behalf of the Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire. Abdul Hamid strikes me as a ruler which, in a more stable period, would have done okay, but not in his era. 30. Osman the Young. A rather short-lived ruler who ended up being a victim of court intrigue as well as, admittedly, a bit of his own political naivety. He ended up being regicided by his eventual successor. 29. Mustafa II. Had to accept the loss of Hungary as a result of ultimately losing the War of the Holy League. When he came into the throne, it was initially a back and forth affair, but had to contend with the outcome, which was written on the wall, even in his predecessor's reign. Then he was deposed after favoring an obsolete part of the military. 28. Mustafa III. Internally, excellent. He took measures to increase prosperity in Istanbul, regulated the currency, had a strict fiscal policy, maintained aqueducts, built large grain storages. He put in the work. Externally though, oh boy. He found out the empire was completely unprepared in fighting against Russia, and though he did implement reforms to turn things around, it's undeniable the war was disastrous, as the Ottomans had to cede Crimea to their Russian enemies. And this can't even be pinned down to anyone else, as he chose to go to war against the insistence of his Grand Vizier. 27. Selim the Drunk. The nickname makes him sound quite a bit worse than what he actually was. In truth, his short reign was full of hits and misses. More misses than hits though. Though his reign started with a favorable treaty with the Holy Roman Emperor, establishment of positive relations between the Ottomans and the Russians, and some successful campaigns, this is also the reign that oversaw the defeat in the Battle of Lepanto. Much like the Invincible Armada, the impact of this defeat is often exaggerated, as the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet in just 6 months. In truth, it served little purpose other than breaking the myth of invincibility the Ottoman navy previously enjoyed. It was also during his reign that Janissaries began increasing their power at the expense of the Sultan. 26. Mehmed II. A short-lived ruler with a somewhat unsuccessful reign. He devoted most of his attention to the War of the Holy League, which had stalemated by the time he became the Sultan. But really, from the moment he became Sultan all the way to his death, the Ottomans saw a slow but sure loosening of their grip on Hungary. 25. Mehmed I. A reign marked by loss of territory against the Safavids from Persia, as well as the long Turkish War, which had already started in his predecessor's reign. Though his reign was notable for its architecture, it has too many misses to be considered a good one. 24. Murad V. Ruled for 93 days and had to abdicate due to his poor physical and mental health. Not a lot to say about him. 23. Mehmed VI. Tried to install some semblance of order after World War I, but the ball never really got rolling in the first place. To be fair, he was in a rather difficult position. 22. Mehmed V. The second to last ruler of the Ottoman Empire was essentially a figurehead of the crumbling entity, so there's really not much to say about him. 21. Osman III. Honestly, a short, fairly unremarkable reign. Not a lot to say about him really. 20. Mehmed III. His reign is marked by a significant conflict with the Austrians, known as the Long Turkish War, which in truth ultimately went nowhere. His reign is kinda forgettable, as he was a fairly idle ruler and not a lot happened in his reign. 19. Mehmed III. For the most part, he was a pretty effective ruler. He succeeded in a war against Russia and left the empire's finances in great condition, and this without bleeding his subjects in taxes. However, he could not balance the difficult act of keeping internal politics and intrigue under control, and he was forced to give up the throne in favor of his nephew, dying 6 years later. 18. Bayezid the Thunderbolt. Okay, so hands down the Ottoman Sultan with the coolest nickname. Even among all historical figures, you won't find many nicknames as cool as the Thunderbolt. That being said, out of the early Ottoman Sultans, Bayezid I has a more mixed legacy. His early reign was great, as he conquered much of Anatolia as well as Bulgaria and northern Greece, but the end of his reign is marked by the failure to conquer Constantinople as well as losing the Battle of Ankara against Timur, which led to his captivity that lasted until his death. This defeat led to the collapse of the Ottoman Sultanate, which wouldn't be resumed for the next 11 years. 17. Murad III. His rule was marked by battles against the Habsburgs and the Safavids. Murad III also had to campaign against Morocco. While externally the empire did well, internally Murad's reign was a period of stress for the Ottoman Empire, as high inflation rates due to the influx of silver from the New World caused unrest and corruption rising among government officials. 16. Mahmud the Hunchback. After a rather hectic rise to power, Mahmud I was an overall good ruler, stamping out his authority early on before focusing the majority of his reign in wars. In the east, he had to deal with a rather troublesome situation as the Safavids collapsed and the Afsharids became the new rulers of Persia and retook control of the Caucasus. In Europe, things went a lot smoother, as the Ottomans had to fight the Austrians and the Russians, beating the first and stalemating the latter. 15. Suleiman II. A short-lived reign for sure, but one that was successful, with him turning the tide of the War of the Holy League by reconquering Belgrade, as well as carrying out fiscal and military reforms. A shame he ruled for such little time. 14. Abdulmejid I. Tried but failed to stop the nationalist tide sweeping across the European part of the empire. Mind you, he didn't lose any land during his reign, but still, the empire was definitely crumbling. Abdulmejid applied the reforms planned by his father, finally managed to integrate the Ottoman Empire as a European power properly by entering the concert of Europe. Also, the Ottomans, alongside the British and the French, beat the Russians in the Crimean War. And by that I mean the British and the French beat the Russians in the Crimean War. 13. Selim III. Very talented and energetic. He sought to reform the army and integrate the Ottoman Empire into European affairs without being seen as an outsider, which, given the Muslim status of the state he was running, was no easy feat. And yet, in both of these regards, he somewhat succeeded. This happened partially due to outside factors, namely Napoleon. While this may have helped, it also gave him pretty much no breathing room. So it would seem like this is the man who would finally turn the empire's fortunes around after 2 poor reigns, right? Wrong. That reformation of the army put the Janissaries against him, and angry Janissaries are murderous Janissaries. After being deposed and executed, all that's left is wondering what could have been. 12. Bayezid II. A patron of both Western and Eastern culture, Bayezid II was a very competent domestic ruler, which earned him the nickname of the Just. He conquered the Phoenician possessions in Morea and defeated the Polish in battle, though his reign was more focused inwards than outwards. Even some of his campaigns were focused inside his own domains, as he had to deal with serious rebellions in the east who were often backed by the Shah of Persia. 11. Murad IV. Initially a puppet, Murad IV grew into an actual emperor and broke out of his relatives' control, all the while avoiding the Janissaries staging a coup. He stamped out corruption, thus restoring judicial regulations, and successfully broke the Safavids, confirming the Caucasus and Mesopotamia as Ottoman territory. 10. Mehmed the Hunter. The second longest ruler after Suleiman the Magnificent, Mehmed IV's reign symbolizes as an important one in Ottoman history. His reign is the one where the empire reaches the height of its territorial expansion. While the first years of his reign were marked by instability, a series of Grand Viziers belonging to the Koprulu family instituted a series of reforms which helped the empire turn its fortunes around. Unfortunately, his reign ended rather unfavorably, as the war against the Austrians and the Holy Alliance ended Ottoman expansion into Europe. And yes, I'm talking about the Second Siege of Vienna, winged hussars, all that jazz. The failure to conquer Vienna actually cost the Koprulu family their hold over the position of Grand Vizier. Ultimately, Mehmed IV ended up being deposed, as killing your Grand Viziers after they lose a battle isn't exactly the most stable way of maintaining their loyalty. Eventually, certain people began to take notice. A bad way to go for someone who presided over such a good period. 9. Murad I. Expanded the Sultanate further in both Europe and Anatolia, defeating the Beylik of Karaman in the latter, all the while defeating the Serbs, the Albanians, the Bulgarians, and the Hungarians in the first. He also added vassals to the Ottoman Sultanate, including, of all things, the Byzantine Empire. Unfortunately, he died in battle against the Serbians. Still a good ruler, though. 8. Mehmed the Restorer. Called the Restorer for, well, restoring what was the Ottoman Sultanate, and to be fair, he was the most powerful of the brothers contending for the throne anyway. He re-established control in much of Anatolia, as well as conquering Wallachia. The loss of his fleet at the hands of the Venetians was the one minor blemish of his reign. 7. Osman I. Though it's undeniable Osman I was a skillful leader, it's difficult to know exactly how good he was. The major reason for this is sources. Not a single contemporary source has survived from his reign, and thus it's difficult to discern which of his feats were fact or fiction. And considering Osman I is the founder of the Ottoman Sultanate, one automatically asks himself just how many of his achievements were fabricated. Regardless, what we do know is Osman founded and expanded his sultanate through exploiting the effective collapse of the Seljuks and going to war against the Byzantines, all the while unprovoking the then stronger Turkish beyliks at the time. Some stories about him are pretty ridiculous, like his dream of a tree whose shade compassed the world, which apparently meant he had God-given authority over the world. Now, I'm not saying this story sounds completely asinine, but this story sounds completely asinine. 6. Murad II. Besides being a period for economic development, Murad II's reign also saw a number of military victories in Anatolia and Europe, annexing Aydin, Germiyan, Menteşe, and Teke in Anatolia, all the while expanding the Sultanate in the Balkans, even defeating a great Christian coalition in the Battle of Varna. His failure in dealing with Skanderbeg and conquering Constantinople are minor blemishes of his reign though. 5. Orhan, the second Ottoman Sultan. Orhan was a fantastic ruler. He greatly expanded the Ottoman Sultanate, even gaining a foothold in Europe through defeating the Byzantines, who were definitely not having a good time during his period. Among the conquests include the city of Nicaea, then the second largest of the Byzantine Empire. He also formed a standing army. Included among the ranks were the newly formed Janissaries, a force composed of the children of the people they conquered. These children would then undergo through training and religious conversion and would zealously fight for the Sultan. When you consider the fact these kids were forcefully taken away from their parents, it becomes clear the entire thing is awful. But I'm actually impressed with the idea. Turning the children of your rebellious subjects into fanatically loyal soldier slaves? That is evil. Ingenious. I can't be mad at that. 4. Mahmud II. He is described as Turkey's Peter the Great, which isn't surprising considering he is the man who began modernizing the Ottoman Empire through political and social changes. His reign isn't perfect, of course. Greece breaking away from the empire was the first of many countries becoming independent all throughout the 19th century. And for the record, as much as I praised Mahmud II, it's undeniable the Ottoman Empire was crumbling at this point. Nevertheless, he is still notable for his greatest achievement, which was, finally, praised be Allah, abolishing the Janissaries, which at this point had definitely become a hindrance to the empire. 3. Selim the Resolute. Only ruled for 8 years, but what 8 years they were. Having defeated the Persians and the Mamluks, he expanded the Ottoman Sultanate by nearly doubling its territory as he gained hold of parts of Armenia, the Levant, Hejaz, much of the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and most notable of all, Egypt. These conquests made the Ottoman Empire the preeminent Muslim state in the world. So ultimately, a short-lived reign, yes, but unquestionably one of the best sultans the Ottomans had. 2. Mehmed the Conqueror. Conquered Constantinople and made it the Sultanate's capital and repopulated the city, as the city had become a ghost town. Conquered Serbia, conquered Morea, conquered Trebizond, conquered Bosnia, submitted Wallachia, weakened Venice's position in the eastern Mediterranean at large, further expanded in Anatolia, finally dealt with Skanderbeg and conquered Albania, destroyed the Moldavian army, added the Crimean Khanate as a tributary state, expanded bureaucracy, and centralized the state. The defeat of the Great Christian Crusade also happened during his reign, but really, it was his father Murad II who did the real work. Still, not a lot more needs to be said. Mehmed II's achievements speak for themselves, and he is easily one of the best sultans in Ottoman history. Only behind, you probably already had an idea who it was. Number 1. Suleiman the Magnificent. Predictable number 1. Suleiman the Magnificent picked up what was already a strong empire and brought it to the height of its power. He conquered Rhodes, Belgrade, and most of Hungary, defeated the Persians and brought Mesopotamia to the empire, and expanded into North Africa. He instituted major changes to society, harmonizing sultanic and religious law, being a patron of culture, and overseeing the golden age of the Ottoman Empire in arts, literature, and architecture. Of course, all the changes brought in by Suleiman weren't entirely his own. He had capable subordinates who could play a major role using their talents, like the Grand Viziers Ibrahim Pasha and Rustem Pasha, the Grand Mufti Ibn Saud Effendi, who played a major role in legal reforms, and Chancellor Celalzadeh Mustafa, who played a role in expanding the bureaucracy. It is still thought the Ottoman Empire began declining as soon as Suleiman died, but this isn't the case actually. The Ottoman Empire remained a powerful player in European and Asian politics for centuries to come. Nevertheless, Suleiman was very likely the greatest Ottoman Sultan. Hope you enjoyed this little list. I'm sorry for all the butchering of the Turkish names that I almost certainly did. I'm not Turkish at all. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comment section below, and if you aren't subscribed, well, at least think about it. I'd really appreciate it. Also, there's a link to my Patreon if you wish to support me there. This was Spectrum, and I'll see you around.